Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, September 27th. Would the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young.
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
Fosdick.
Here.
Morrow. Absent. Gearbaugh.
Here.
Cole. Here. Beardsley.
Here.
Heft. Here. Troika.
Here.
Staff present tonight are City Planner Auerbach, Community Development Director Harrington, and Recording Secretary Katnick. Mr. Beardsley added a discussion item about short-term rentals. With that, would anybody like to make a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
So moved. Second.
All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. Is there a motion on the table to approve the meeting minutes of September 13th, 2023 as submitted?
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at any time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Seeing no comments, we'll move to new business, number 23-23, the 2023 Saline Master Plan Draft, Goals and Policies Chapter, a motion to acknowledge the receipt of the memo dated September 22nd, 2023 from Community Development Director Harrington.
Thank you. Awesome. I owe you those maps, too. I knew I was supposed to print something off before I came up here. It was working in our permitting software, so I apologize for letting that slip. But I'll get those to you before the end of the meeting, so if you just want to hang tight right when we end, I'll have those printed off. So we're talking about goals and policies this evening. This is one of the leading chapters out of the master plan. We had previously gone over the 7 overarching goals, which we can bring back if we'd like as well. So these are just 5 of these policy sections. Some of them I'll go into more depth in, and on others, some of them haven't really changed very much. Some of them have changed rather substantially. I would say that these 5 are probably less contentious than the next 5 that you'll see at a later meeting. So I just wanted to kick it off, and it should hopefully be a pretty quick meeting this evening. So the plan has 10 policy areas: historic and visual character, general land use and development, residential land use, downtown district land use, commercial land use, industrial land use, transportation, municipal service expansion, environment, sustainability and resilience, intergovernmental cooperation. They're all essentially identical to the policy areas outlaid in the 2017 master plan. The one being primarily different is the downtown district land use. And then we changed the name from environment to environment, sustainability, and resilience to kind of have the same alignment with how we were surveying folks. And I should add that the ones in green are the ones we'll be discussing this evening. So historic and visual character, land use, downtown district land use, commercial land use, and industrial land use. So the organization is that each policy area has a few overarching goals, and then each goal has specific objectives. We kind of talked about this originally when we were talking about the draft to start with. Each objective is then being addressed in the implementation plan, which is not really being discussed here tonight. We're really just talking about the goals and then the objectives. So to start with historic and visual character, the goals remain the same of maintain and enhance the unique and balanced character of Saline. The items highlighted in green on these slides have been additions. Everything else has remained rather untouched. So the main addition here is maintain mature trees and historic structures while allowing for adaptive reuse and housing options that meet a variety of needs. This was worded with accessory dwelling units primarily in mind, carriage houses, that type of thing. Yes, we want to maintain these historic structures as well as finding ways to preserve them by using them potentially in different and unique ways. Other than that, soil planning areas for context-sensitive mixed use and ensuring that new development and redevelopment projects promote an image that is compatible with the existing character of the city, and then maintaining the historic nature of downtown through the form-based code has remained a priority or a key objective of this goal. On the next slide, again, you'll see that this chapter hasn't been edited very heavily. This is one that I have fully fleshed out. The other sections won't have this much detail, but just because I know it's an area of interest for you all. Develop facilities and activities that advance local historic preservation. So we have maintain up-to-date tools and techniques for the preservation, conservation, funding opportunities, historic resources. I know, like I said, this is all mentioned in the 2017 plan. I think really the meat of this is how we're actually going to implement it, because there's not a lot of teeth to this other than just saying that we're interested in doing it. Develop local historic districts that are compatible with community values. So we currently have 2, but I know there's been talk among some city council members about perhaps expanding that to more areas. And that's definitely something that warrants consideration if those areas are, historic. Mid-century modern homes, Mr. Gearbaugh has mentioned previously, could then start falling under historic classification. Continue cooperation between the Historic District Commission, the Saline Area Historical Society, and city departments to ensure that any city-owned properties that have historic qualities are correctly, adequately maintained and preserved. There is a house on Russell that we all, or maybe some of us are aware of, that has kind of lost its luster over the years and lost a lot of its historic features. So trying to find ways to make sure that that doesn't happen to more of our homes around community. This one is somewhat interesting considering that I haven't witnessed the cooperation, but continued cooperation between the Historic District Commission and the Planning Commission to ensure that historic resources outside of the established historic districts receive appropriate review and preservation consideration. With some of these, it's difficult with single-family homes or even some of these smaller-scale apartments to make sure that the Planning Commission is reviewing them if they are making tangible changes to their site. So there's perhaps other things we can do going forward within our D1 and D2 districts at the very least to ensure that we're preserving those historic homes. And then lastly, historic preservation and the redevelopment of the downtown district is important. It used to be the central business district. That's just a nomenclature thing we've done throughout this, going from central business district to downtown district. New development within the downtown should be respectful of the historic nature of the area. And then lastly, we've retained gateways, so it's no longer one of those 7 leading goals of the plan, but it is still featured in the historic and visual character. The spread of narrow, linear, or what is commonly referred to as strip commercial patterns should be discouraged and clustered commercial development encouraged. Provide for appropriate access management techniques in order to avoid inadequate driveway spacing or placement and encourage non-motorized transportation alternatives. What you're not going to see on this slide is the one objective that was removed, which specifically says we're going to try to keep commercial uses out of that North Ann Arbor, South Ann Arbor corridor. I don't know if that's a leading policy of the city, considering that we have looked at potentially allowing more potentially OS services as that Liberty School campus changes over the years. There's been interest from folks around the industrial park areas in Woodland and Maple to potentially allow for more commercial industrial type uses. I think it could go either way. If we would like to maintain that as a goal to prevent commercial development from happening in on our north-south gateways and really want to limit it to the East and West Michigan Avenue gateway, that's absolutely fine and maybe something that worth discussing at the end of this. Under general land use and development, there's 2 goals. Land use intensity shall depend on the capacity of infrastructure, compatibility of land use patterns, and natural capacity of the land. In the plan itself, you'll see that it's just descriptions of what low intensity, medium intensity, and high intensity uses look like. We didn't really make very many modifications there. The next goal is promote compatible relationships between land uses. So we added 1 word to the first goal. All planned land uses shall be designed to protect the general aesthetic, character, safety, and welfare of existing neighborhoods. Again, focusing on this idea of aesthetic, kind of moving away from some concept of density and then moving more towards what are we really concerned about the visual final product of the city. So aesthetic, it didn't replace anything, it's just an addition. Next, the conditions which lead to blight shall be removed and the rehabilitation of deteriorating residences shall be encouraged. This is a goal that's maintained, but I think it's an important one, and again, that's kind of fleshed out more in the implementation plan. And then lastly, multifamily or mixed-use developments adjacent or near single-family neighborhoods shall be designed to match the general visual aesthetic of the area, really emphasizing that, this might be something that's proposed to the city in the future, but we have now an item to point to say if this is what you're proposing, it really needs to conform to the visual qualities of Saline. It needs to look historic in some respects. Next up is downtown district land use. It only has 1 goal, which is to create a center for the community that mixes retail, service, office, residential, and public leisure uses. You make an argument that could be several independent goals or an overarching goal, either or. This was the only policy area that was added because, as I mentioned, it used to be folded into the central business district, which was kind of crossed in the residential district, the residential policies and the commercial policies. So we've made downtown its own policy area separate of both residential and commercial. So the objectives we have are to continue to promote Saline Main Street and the work they do to build community, hold events, support businesses, and create an inviting downtown environment. Engage a consultant to perform a downtown design study that evaluates the creation of public space downtown. The study should be comprehensive and provide options and cost estimates. The language that's highlighted in yellow has been slightly tweaked from what's in your packet after our first round of revisions with Carlisle Wortman. Just kind of being less definitive, saying, although we would like to support the creation of one public space, maybe softening the language to consider the support, because obviously there are economic factors, there are factors related to the parking lots that the city owns downtown and reverter clauses that we have to be conscientious of. How feasible it is, we'll kind of figure out through these studies. Provide for downtown parking needs while pursuing opportunities to redevelop underutilized parking areas. Promote and attract mixed-use development into the downtown area. Identify development and redevelopment opportunity sites, especially on vacant parcels. This is highlighted in yellow because it had one property specifically called out, which is on West Michigan Avenue. Again, probably not best policy to poke the bear if you don't have to, so just softening the language a little bit to not target any specific property. Actively seek out grant dollars that will support the improvement of downtown businesses and properties. Work with MDOT on the creation of safer pedestrian crossings throughout the downtown, and especially at the intersection of Ann Arbor Street and Michigan Avenue. Commercial land use has remained pretty much identical to what it was. Provide commercial areas that meet the needs of city residents in terms of location and services offered. Those specific goals have descriptions of the 3 commercial designations, professional business, office service, and commercial. I don't believe we tangibly changed those items at this point in time. So they're pretty much the same descriptions that they had in 2017. Again, the bulk of those changes really being in the implementation plan found throughout this. How are we going to marry these goals and these objectives with how we're planning on implementing the plan? So it's not that content was necessarily bad, it's just that there wasn't a clear direction on where to take it. And then lastly, industrial land use. So we have 2 goals. One is to encourage a diversified research office and industrial base. And the second is to promote compatible relationships between land uses. It's a particular concern with industry, especially ones that cause negative externalities, whether that be noise, air pollution, light. So promote a complementary mix of uses in existing and future industrial and research office parks. Heavy industrial manufacturing, self-storage. I've expressed my disdain of self-storage to you all many times. I've added it here to, again, kind of call it out as a special land use to ensure that it will always be treated as a special land use. So making sure that we're treating it as self-storage or mini storage, whatever you want to call it, with a higher degree of scrutiny, as we'll never be able to get rid of it once it's built. Buffers and screens, transitional uses, landscaping, and sufficient setbacks between residential and industrial research and office development shall be provided. This kind of goes on this idea of green belts that we've previously talked about here, especially looking at the East Michigan corridor, making sure that those industrial uses don't get too close to our residential ones. And then one that's been slightly tweaked is to promote the development or redevelopment of vacant or underutilized properties into businesses or spaces that serve Sterling residents. So it's kind of looking again, as we talked about at that last meeting, adaptive reuse of some industrial areas to maybe be more resident facing as opposed to kind of attracting a workforce that we know doesn't live in Saline. So I told you it would be quick. Items for the Planning Commission's considerations. Are there any specific goals or objectives that you take issue with out of these 5 and want to be refined? Are there any that you want to see added? Do you have any feedback on the way that the plan is organized? Is the organizational consistency from 2017 what you were hoping for? And then what other items do you might have commentary on, whether that be these 5 areas or another 5 that you might have looked ahead at? So I will send it back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Discussion.
Of course, I have a whole bunch, but I'm going to let everyone else discuss first before I try to monopolize the group.
Well, looks like you're it for now.
Okay.
You get started.
Just a couple things as I started looking through this, and then it's kind of one of the things that we're using new terminology and so forth. One of the issue is when you mentioned reuse or readapt housing, it seems like it's more driving towards readapting and reusing housing throughout the entire city. So even though we may have single-family residential homes and things, it acts as if it's the idea that eventually we're going to move to allowing the division of homes, or even, we talk about auxiliary units and things like that, which is kind of different. But I look at this as the readaptation as like, when you start turning a lot of homes into apartments, it changes the aspect of the neighborhood, but it also affects the economic vitality. Because the prime example I'm using is Ypsilanti and how they did that and cut it all up, and then now trying to revert backwards is becoming difficult for them to make that. So just understanding that, and how does that play out against our zoning and everything else. So that's just a general understanding.
So can I just ask a follow-up question? Would you like it potentially more narrowly defined specifically around accessory dwelling units? I think that was our general intent writing it, thinking about how do we use some of these older, maybe larger
Yeah, I
structures?
think that would be helpful, because when we talk about readapting, my concern is that we have some major homes that if you were to cut them up into apartment houses, you'd lose even the historical aspect of the interior.
Okay.
You'd be wanting doors cut, and things like that, or even the homes would be potentially spliced up even more than 1 or 2 apartments. I just didn't know how that plays out. That's just my opinion. I'm not sure about the rest of the planning commission. One of the things I saw where we talk in the general planning goals, it says, you know, an ideal place to raise a family and have a uniquely high quality of life. How do we deal with seniors and singles? It's kind of like how to encourage that. We seem to focus on the family, but that whole definition is becoming so much wider and broader that I don't necessarily want to make it sound like that Saline's only interested in that one of our main goals. So
No.
whatever we do to encourage that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's featured more in the residential section as we talk about different types of attainable housing. I didn't bring that forward because I'm still working on some revised language that moves away from the unit per acres numbers and more into describing what we're hoping to see as like the physical built environment of those lots. So like city density, maybe row houses that are taller rather than wide, you know, having that historic brick facade, brick siding as opposed to traditional siding. So
Maybe your definition of aging in place and all that, that whole section, I appreciate. That's
Yeah.
much different than what we did previously, so that helps with that explanation. It's just in that goal of that page, raising a family is so much different in 2023 than what it was.
right, and I would just say on the whole of it, Saline has very large single-family lots. You know, tangibly, we're not proposing to change the size of existing homes or lots like that, but when we're adding new housing, looking at, you know, more variety of options of smaller lots, smaller homes, potentially with a little bit higher, smaller, I guess smaller lots, smaller homes is the best way to put it, because it implicitly means there's going to be slightly more density, but I think that's probably where that's addressed more so than in these other 5 goals. Policy areas, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and actually that was just, it's on that page 12, I just noticed that there. Oh, there were just some, like, grammatical issue in goal 4 on page 13. There's like a comma where it says key people in, comma, Saline, period.
Right, I can double check that. I think Mr. CEO has pointed that one out to me before too.
As I'm looking at the next one, there's a wording in there, foster, promote intergovernmental cooperation, including planning between the city of Saline, its official, and agencies. And so we took out the plural. Can we maybe add development, your title or whatever, to be more specific? I want to not necessarily have it referring to us, council members and political individuals.
Absolutely.
And then, never mind, the other question I had about goal 6, but you moved that into another section, which is good. You had mentioned about historic agencies, including the historic commission. How can we tie in state historic and incentives in the historical aspect of page like 14 or so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a realistic objective. We can add that language to them and make sure that, you know, communication with state historic agencies, it's not my area of expertise, but I can definitely talk to our staff liaison, and as well as the Historic Society is probably my best bet on this one. So about those types of agencies and perhaps contacts we could establish there.
It's trying to encourage the whole, I know the state's starting to look at incentives again, and tax incentives and so forth, so that's what really helps encourage people to want to move into homes and maintain them. On the redevelopment community gateway, where we talk about on page 15, you had talked about and dealt with it. What do we need to do about, I'm concerned about, like Waterworks Road, Austin, Monroe, some of the main ones that will become main roads coming into town. So maybe we need to start considering adding those in, because those will become main thoroughfares into Saline.
No, I thought of Austin the second when you mentioned Monroe and Waterworks, and like I didn't even think about with Andalina Farms coming on, it's going to have a tangible, it is a gateway to your point. So I think that's definitely language we can add. If there's more commentary on the Planning Commission's perspective on this, are you supportive of more commercial, you know, whether it be neighborhood, coffee shops? I think that's kind of the general direction the field of planning is headed in, but there's also some density requirements to make, you know, neighborhood stores and coffee shops viable. So There's some considerations there about whether we want to expand the uses perhaps in these gateway sections to accommodate those types of maybe light neighborhood retail, neighborhood service, or if we just want to leave it strictly residential. That's also very much an option. And I think that will inform us as we look to go back to the OS and the PB zoning codes that we discussed 2 meetings ago.
I do know the one thing that I would like to see discouraged, whatever, if you ever look at the corner of Textile and State, how those subdivisions were designed, and then they put the commercial in front of it, and it, I don't know, it just doesn't blend.
That was the exact place I was thinking of, if that's what you were talking about with light, light retail near residential. Like, that is, those places will never get filled, or at least they don't seem like they will because they're in front of, I don't know.
Well, and it's obviously a different example, but on Miller and Ann Arbor, as you're kind of driving out westward of the town, there's a bakery called Little City, Small World, or something like that. So it's in an old rehabbed brick apartment building, and a Knight's Market is like directly across the street. So I mean, we're talking more about that intensity of commercial, at least in my mind. Now, granted, there's also a dispensary across the street from that too, which is probably not a use we would like to see. But I mean, the building is neat. I mean, it's designed to look and be low density. So these are just considerations. There's no right or wrong answer. It's all just about personal preference and city preference. What do we really want to see in those areas? So.
Because even like, there's an example on the corner of Stadium and, what is that? Stadium and Packard. There's a small shopping center there that used to be a grocery store, but they split it into a little business, but it's really small in height and stature and closer to the street. But it's kind of that type of thing, which I think would fit in, like you're mentioning. I think for me, it's really putting parking lots in front and all that stuff as you come into town. We've been really lucky that we've been able to preserve how you come into both the north and south of the town that just does not look like necessarily Michigan Avenue. And what are we going to do to preserve that, at least at that point when you come in, and then how would we transition? So like when we're doing the Mitch Roads, new building, that kind of thing, how that's planned. I know we need to allow for that, but it needs to blend in and where there may be locations. I just think our gateway plan has worked well, and that helps.
No, absolutely.
Talk about that.
But I think that makes a lot of sense, and there's different elements we can use with form code that I think we can insert to this plan that I think will then help us when we're going back to take a look at the uses allowed and potentially how we're regulating some of these things. So thank you.
Then on page 16, where we talk about high-intensity land uses require a high level of infrastructure and shall be located where these facilities exist and where natural resource efficient and existing land use patterns. Can we put in there something or somehow tied in with provided through development agreements or development funded by developers or something to that aspect?
I was nixed on my impact fees because apparently the state of Michigan doesn't allow you to have an impact fee policy, but I'm pretty sure we can charge development fees commensurate to the expected use, but it's not necessarily, we can't create an impact fee policy, unfortunately.
Well, it was kind of like I know we can't do that. It's like what we were going to do with Adelina Farms. We reached an agreement that would give us $5 million towards infrastructure and installing some of that. So it's the thing that Colleen has always been talking about as we talk about expanding. In this case, it says only if it exists. Well, it's only going to exist if somebody pays for it.
That makes sense.
So whatever we do in terms of terminology. And I think I wrote down underneath that, under promote compatible relationships, we removed a number of the red, encourage, promote well-designed architecture, landscape, and such. Have you covered that somewhere else?
I'm sorry, what was that question?
On page 16, underneath promote compatible, there's a number of strikeouts that refer to more like reducing the number of curb cuts, encouraging the use of combined drives and service drives. It's kind of a development thing.
It's just going to take me 1 second to pull that.
It says mitigate the impact of new development on public roads, and it lists all this stuff. I'm assuming that's somehow tied into somewhere else.
I would believe it. Yeah, I mean, the goal is obviously not to increase curb cuts. Can you just tell me the page one more time? The one in
16.
16.
Considering it's been a big push by MDOT especially.
Yes, so I think some of this content will be covered in the Environment and Natural Resources section where there's stormwater-specific goals. And I think there's language throughout the plan that talks about sort of a change in access management policy. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, I guess, I just noticed that some of this more specific stuff, I know you're trying to eliminate, but it's going to try and capture it under some more generic, or, I just want to make sure that that type of thing is consistent with what we've always practiced.
Or if anything, we're going to be bolstering some of the landscaping and access management stuff. So, but yes, I'll make sure that that's included in the text of the plan. Thank you.
And I think that the theme throughout the document, a lot of it does come back to a basis for broadening sort of form-based or architectural standards and also expanding landscape standards.
I think there's only other spot I saw was, you had mentioned on page 21, and you had mentioned it up here about traffic on MDOT and making safe for pedestrian crossings, and it says downtown and especially the intersection of Ann Arbor Street and Michigan Avenue. I would just like to say, downtown and Michigan Avenue.
Okay.
And that whole stretch of road is now going to be used more, especially if we put in any kind of apartment complexes in there. Every single intersection is going to be an issue. That's as far as I got through for some of this stuff. Oh, and the only other one, of course, this is what we've already been talking about. We talk about on page 25 about objectives in terms of annexation and that. How can we put a clear indicator in here about the islands?
I think that we could add to that language that we're interested in any opportunity to annex islands within the city. I'm still not sure, talking to the city manager, what our legal recourse is to compel people who are island properties to, somebody has pointed out the one on North Ann Arbor, for example, is for sale, or one of them is at least a different one. It's actually directly south of the building we talked about 2 weeks ago. But I don't know even if the sale necessarily allows us to instigate that annexation process, so.
And there are some things that you can do, and it's how you address it for future purchases and sales of lands and things like that, which we need to consider in terms of being able to get those properties into the city. But somehow I think we need to address that specific as to properties that receive city services and utilities because of recent changes need to really seriously be brought into the city to effectively, I guess I would say, that they share in the responsibilities of the community in terms of costs and such. They're getting a benefit of the city, which we should be able to challenge. And with that, I think that's it for me right now.
Yes.
I'll pick up where he left off. Let me start with page 16. I think what Mr. Gerbaugh was saying and what I had noted, just confusion was why all of those bullets were deleted. Were you trying to put them somewhere else? And I think you said you are, but it's, by themselves, they don't look objectionable.
No.
But maybe they're a little cluttered.
Right, so it was a little too specific compared to the level that the other objectives were at.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I now can see that they are part of the implementation plan. That is more specific about what we are doing.
Got it.
So for example, you can tell that the previous person in this capacity was an engineer, which is fantastic because these are really fleshed out ideas. So they're moved primarily to the implementation plan rather than being featured as a long form of an
Got
objective.
it. On page 17, number 7, you talk about the appearance of multifamily or mixed-use developments near single-family shall be designed as to match the general visual aesthetic of the area. That's really hard for me to figure out what that means, because every neighborhood might be a little different. The historic example's the perfect one, right? But I just think maybe a little better understanding of that when you're not dealing with uniquely designed homes like historic ones.
Absolutely. So I think if you're looking at like a suburban lot, for example, you're going to expect the home to be placed more in the center of the lot with dedicated side yards on both sides. So if you're talking about potentially putting a duplex in a more of a traditional suburban neighborhood, making sure that it maintains that general overall appearance, that it's going to be placed in the center of the lot, that there's no like parking right in front of the house, that it has that dedicated front lawn space. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about. It's like if 2 people live there, that might be fine, depending on our zoning code. But if it's going to be there, it needs to really blend into the rest of the neighborhood. So like Torwood, for example, you would expect it, which the HOA might prohibit anyways, but you would expect it to look like a home in Torwood, even if there happens to be 2 front doors to it.
Okay. I applaud the separate section on downtown. I think that's really, really important to elevate the visibility of what we want downtown to be. I'd like to see a little more emphasis on the social gathering component of downtown to attract people to actually be a community downtown. And I know there's reference to some community gathering places, but I just feel like there might be a little more. I'm not going to suggest social district yet, but something that feels like people can come together and enjoy company, almost like an urban park, if you will, in downtown. The other observation, it's maybe more of a simple observation. It seems that you're proposing, or that we're proposing, that the importance of protecting the industrial land for industrial purposes, where it's much more expensive from an infrastructure standpoint, isn't going to be as necessary in the future as it has been in the past, which is almost a shift a little bit more towards service and residential as opposed to jobs, if you will. Could you help me maybe with that?
No, that's absolutely somewhat of the intent, and we could provide a lot of, we could have a whole conversation on this topic alone because I think it's fascinating, but there's something called longitudinal employer household dynamics data, and essentially you can do an inflow-outflow analysis of our residents that are in the workforce, how many of them work in Saline versus how many of them work elsewhere, other people that are working in Saline, how many of them live here, how many of them live elsewhere. Talking to industrial employers, the data confirms, the anecdote confirms that the vast majority of people in Saline do not work in Saline. About 90% of our residents go work somewhere else, and coincidentally, about 90% of the people that work here live somewhere else. And we know that they're living in Belleville, they're living in Tecumseh, some of them live in Ypsilanti or even further out in Lenawee County. So I think that's the general trend that we're acknowledging. The price of our land is getting more expensive, so we're also a fully built-out community. So in terms of the new projects that the state is really supporting, these super sites like the one in Marshall, we're just really not, unfortunately, great candidates for. And that has its pros and its cons. But I think that's kind of the overarching emphasis of some of those goals, too, is making Saline a great place to live. It's not always, it's really hard for us to be a great place to work and have great recreational opportunities for our residents and have great housing for our residents. So it is pushing a little bit away from the emphasis of a great place to work in that sense, but I don't know if that makes sense. And it's a contentious item, and I'm happy for pushback, and it's just one perspective on the community.
I think it makes perfect sense, and I think, though, everyone needs to understand, it really is a statement that says we're going to be more bedroom community here. We're going to be more community live here than necessarily diversified from an employment base. So I think where that really matters is making sure that the numbers work from an economic standpoint, because probably didn't even get all our money out of some of that infrastructure in the industrial park. So if we don't have the personal property tax, or whatever they call it now, and if we don't have the other tax revenues coming from employers, how does that look 20 years from now for our budget? Even though I think what you're proposing makes perfect sense as a resident, you want to make sure it works over time.
And that's something we've done. There's a book I have on my desk called Fiscal Impact and Spatial Planning Analysis, which is really looking at what do you get the most bang for your buck for. So again, that kind of goes back to some of these other goals of potentially reducing setbacks in commercial districts, or at least side setbacks on East Michigan Avenue, to be higher density commercial users, but get more use out of the land. It's more taxable acreage. But I think most interestingly, Forcia's benefits from being like one of the lowest taxpayers per acre in our community. Their land is drastically undervalued for how much space they're taking up. And if you put a handful of single family homes on that site, especially the ones that we saw built in Huntington Woods, we recoup that revenue relatively quickly. It's surprising and it's unfortunate in some respects, especially now that we're unable to tax that personal property, which I know is one of the reasons in Genesis is for the industrial parks that we have here. I would add, too, that I don't think we're getting super aggressive. We're not saying we're going to infill all the industrial, but perhaps the things that are on Woodland and Maple, as we've already started to see, of some of those future land use designations flipping to become residential. So there's some pros and cons with that, too, and we can soften the language, we can strengthen that language. But
I would just encourage our our treasurer and others to really take that long view and make sure that it works from an economic standpoint. It'll be long after many of us are serving on this commission, but important to look at. But you've done a really great job, and I know we're going to hit probably the more difficult ones on the residential in a couple weeks, probably.
Additional comments?
Just so for my sort of edification, when you talk about providing options for aging in place, well, what are specific examples of things that we could do from a land use perspective to facilitate aging in place?
So from the land use perspective, I think it goes back to what is one of the biggest difficulties of aging in place is maintaining a large lot and maintaining a large home. So potentially looking at ways that we could accommodate people for smaller lots and smaller homes that they can live in their community. I think I've shared this statistic with you before, but Livonia Builders, which built Cascade Apartments and Westgate Apartments, has told me that 75% of his renters are over the age of 60. Probably 50% of those people are over the age of 75 even. So we really have this older population that are going to these multifamily products because they don't have to maintain the yard, because they don't have to maintain the home, and they're not responsible for it. So I think that's one element of it.
Are ADUs another part of it? I mean, are we anticipating that caretakers would move into ADUs?
Yeah, so I think that's been something that was discussed. The variance that was given for the one ADU that will be operational eventually, I think he's still in the permitting process, was given with that specific person's parent in mind.
Yes.
As the resident of that ADU. The validity, the thing with the ADUs, I think, is challenging, and it's true for apartments too. In the long run, it could essentially accommodate whoever it would want to. So it doesn't have to necessarily be the elderly parent. It could be commercially rented, and I think that goes back to Mr. Gearbaugh's question about singles as well. You're looking at a different demographic. There are examples of Mill Pond Manor, for example, in our community, or Maple Heights, which are both affordable voucher accepting housing entities. The city's also helped provide pilot programs for those to excuse them of property taxes in exchange for them putting in new cabinetry or flooring or a dishwasher, things like that. So we can bolster that language as well. There was previously specific language about considerations for housing for seniors, but after talking to Carlisle Wortman, it seemed like that language is a little too aggressive, a little holding people to a standard, an unfair standard. We're like deliberately writing out that we're holding separate standards for different projects. And that's where it might get a little legally dicey, but.
The age discrimination issues in the 55 and older communities.
Right.
One thing that I believe we've already talked about, but I don't fully understand, when we talk about a public space downtown, are there specific proposals for a public space downtown that are now in consideration?
So there's nothing specific. We have allocated dollars for a downtown design study. I just performed title searches on all three of the main downtown parking lots. So the one behind Comerica Bank, it's called the West Henry, or the East Henry lot. So behind Comerica, Max, the one behind Dan's, and then the one on the other side of South Ann Arbor Street. So we're just getting information on what are our restrictions. The city bought or took most of those through eminent domain. There's reverter clauses attached, but potentially looking at infilling one of those. I've had the opportunity to volunteer at both our summer events, Summerfest and Oktoberfest, and then there's nobody parking at City Hall. There's not a lot of people parking on the street.
Yeah.
So we have parking. We know that we're over-parked in its totality as a community, so maybe looking at our own land first. The Presbyterian Church is also looking to close Hall Street and move some houses, and there's some promise with that proposal as well, potentially a way to create public space downtown.
Yeah, but we're looking at interior space, or would this be like outside farm?
This is primarily looking at outdoor space, but I think that design study, which will have the Main Street organization, the downtown property owners heavily involved in, so they have ownership of it too, because we need a commercial buy-in just as much as we need the public buy-in.
No, thank you, that helps. One of the comment I had is, it looked to me like we removed the standard of having our entire community walkable. That might be a concession to reality, but I'm just curious what the thought process was there.
So yeah, that was a comment that was made at the town hall too. We just kind of changed some of the language in that overarching goal. And I think it would make sense to change it back to, again, emphasize that the purpose of walkability. That's definitely hit a lot in the transportation and the environment, sustainability, and resilience section, that we want aggressive pedestrian pathways, that we do want full sidewalk access. So the walkability aspect hasn't changed. And I do think that That's something that we're much better positioned than you'd be, if you go to Auburn Hills, there's not sidewalks. So it's really great that Saline has such a complete network of sidewalks. Sometimes it's just a maintenance issue, sometimes it's painting the crosswalks again issue, but that's so much easier, I have to say, than trying to take right away 50 years after the fact. So I would say by and large, we're relatively well positioned. It's just a matter of execution, finding places for paths, and then finding the funding for it.
My last comment, there is a statement in here that we have other annexation agreements in place, and I'm just curious, do we have an inventory of what those properties are?
So one of them is actually coming into the city. It's on Maple. It was this house that's like on the bottom of the south part of Lee Bear's property. So it's like you'll see Bell Terrace and then this big field and then this little house next to an industrial building. So that one is being automatically annexed in. We're currently in negotiations with Jerry's Tire. That's a long story. And then there is this defined urban development area, from my understanding, that the township and the city came in agreements to. It's not instant annexation, but there are ways that it should, in theory, come to the city. So Andalina Farms, in theory, should have come into the city, but again, there's a lot of details there of why those things didn't specifically happen. So.
And if I understand, Andalina Farms, that ship has sailed, it's not going to be annexed probably ever.
Now with individual owners, it's going to be very difficult. There is a second phase potentially happening, but with the interest rates so high, it's kind of in a holding pattern at the moment, so.
There's also going before the State Board of Commission.
I forgot that one too.
Board of Commission is the property on the corner of Waterworks and North and Harbor Street. Schumer property, that whole section there across from where Danny Beery had already developed.
That's going before the Boundary Commission?
Yeah.
And then actually, there's another gentleman who called me about the property north of that even, northwest of that, outside of the city as well. Another huge estate, stead, whatever you want to call it, that would also potentially be coming into the city. Again, we have utilities and our township counterparts don't. That definitely puts us in a stronger position in terms of annexing these folks in, but that there's not any hard and fast agreement on those specific properties.
And to be completely clear, the only annexation agreement we've ever had as a city is with Pittsfield Township. So the idea of those properties on Maple that.
Or Bella Terrace or
Bella
Lair
Terrace,
Farms?
although they challenged us on a 40-year agreement, so we had to negotiate on that. That had held up in court. But yeah, we have no other annexation agreement in terms of if developer asks us to come in, then we'll immediately annex that property in like we could with.
But we don't have existing 425 agreements for other properties?
Yeah, right now, that's basically what we've negotiated for everything. Yeah, I'm trying to think.
So I'd say a lot of that actually has changed since when we started writing this plan, so we might have to tweak that language even just to.
Primarily, 425 agreements is what works the best, the agreements are that way, so.
Supposing the Andalina Farms wastewater treatment failed,
Yes.
would that then put annexation back on the table?
Potentially, it's going to be, like I said, it's a little bit trickier when you have individual property owners. It's something I did spend the time to talk to Eagle's 6 regulators about. How are they doing this? It'd be appalled. I'm appalled that it happens in the way that it does. And there's like, it's like if you're not within 100 feet of a sewer, like that's the line they're drawing is 100 feet, which is, I think we can all admit, pretty laughably small. I mean,
I'm downstream more than 100 feet. That
right.
matters.
So it's going to be interesting, and if it fails, they're not checking their account, as they patently told me that we're not making sure they have the funds to do it. And when we cite them, then it's their responsibility to figure out how they're going to come up with the funds, not making sure that it's guaranteed to begin with, which just seems again really backwards of how it should. But they're held to state regulations too, so it's not really their Eagle's fault necessarily.
There's only one development that I know where that situation happened, and they basically forced them to connect to the municipality that was close to them. So we anticipate that's what's going to happen.
Right, so there's a couple in mid-Michigan that I believe have already started to fail. They predicted that it was going to become more regular just because the price of managing a wastewater treatment plant was not the price that they set up or planned for when they budgeted. I mean, it's like an HOA. I mean, they have a budget, they set a 10% growth, whatever, inflation rate, and it didn't meet the cost of the plant materials.
Their reserve study doesn't cover replacing their wastewater facility.
Yeah. So.
All right, thank you.
Additional comments?
Just another one. Ben, you noticed the number of items that were struck out of the environmental aspect. I noticed some were moved, but what was kind of a summary of the ones that you removed and why?
I did not prepare for the environmental one specifically for this meeting, but
Oh, never mind. If it's for the next one. I'm sorry, I just thought it was part of this.
Oh, so yeah, I can see it again. So I can just go over it quickly. So once again, woodlands and groundwater are very specifically mentioned of how they want them to be considered, the depth in which they need to be considered. A lot of that's been moved to the implementation section of it. But we've talked to the planner Auerbach about potentially bolstering that again, but just kind of bolstering it in a little bit of a different way. So we like considering a wetland ordinance or a woodland ordinance. So rather than just having it in the master plan as a standard, really emboldening it within our own law. And some of that's going to be, I think, accomplished with our engineering review standards that are still forthcoming in the next couple of months. I've been working with Sally Boss from OHM on looking at impervious surfaces and some other items that I'm particularly concerned about.
The implementation plan. How is that referenced in this master plan so that that helps reinforce what we're doing between the plan and implementation?
Right, so it's designed to nest as goals, objectives, and then each objective has specific steps attached to it. So each objective has very specific things that we're planning to uphold or to do specifically as a staff for the next 5 years.
And that's part of the whole plan that we...
Yeah, it's attached at the end of this plan and some of the versions of it. So if you were to go to the one on the website right now, you'll see that the whole implementation, there's some redundancies and it's a Word table. And if any of you have ever made a table in Word, you know that it can be kind of a nightmare. So we're trying to consolidate a little bit of that. And some of it literally is repetitive because the goal or objective in one section of environment happens to be similar to transportation. So there's still some, kind of consolidation work to do there. But the overarching plan is to go from implementation backwards into the objective. So they should be inherently connected with identical language.
And this is new for our community, from your perspective. Is that pretty well adopted in the other ones surrounding us, or are we kind of leading the...
I mean, it's an RRC requirement is to have a formal implementation plan, but doing this is, you could call it an implementation matrix, is a relatively common way to achieve this. Ours might be a little bit more specific than some of these other neighboring ones, but I'm on the Mishta Region K board or whatever, and it's kind of very similar with how they're trying to do the statewide housing plan there is doing an implementation matrix steps.
Yeah, it's common practice.
I'm just encouraging it because I don't know what our surrounding townships are doing. And if we can get to this kind of coordination, this might help us achieve a lot of stuff for growth. So good job.
Additional comments? If there's no additional comments, is there a motion on the table to acknowledge receipt of the memo dated September 22nd?
So moved.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes.
And then if I could just add, I think we set like an October deadline. I don't remember the specific date I gave you. I think it was the 24th. It's like the day after, it's the 23rd. So if you have written comments, if you have anything else you'd like to add, just if you can have the written versions of it or emailed to me or given to me by October 23rd, so that way I can help incorporate that into the plan.
Just a question about that. So our next meeting is the 9th, right? October 11th?
Yes.
That's our last one where we will be receiving a section to look through and to provide comments before the 23rd?
Yeah, we might go over some outstanding things on the 25th if there's still lingering questions or conversations to have. But yeah, the 11th should be the last one. And then 207 Monroe's final PUD should likely be coming to you on the 25th. So we received their resubmittal, and it looked pretty promising the first time around. They just missed some details. So.
Great, thank you. Mr. Beardsley, short-term rentals.
I don't want to presume that you all are keeping up on this, but I'll just hit it for 45 seconds, and then I'm going to guess that there's people around this table that have this on their radar. But maybe over a year ago, we were encouraged to voice our concern about some state legislators who were creating legislation to actually prohibit local communities from regulating short-term rentals, which would be a tremendous intrusion upon this body and council and in our rights. So those bills, I think, are still hung up a little bit, but it's becoming more and more problematic for communities. And it just seems to me that we ought to have something in place. And I'm not advocating for or against. I'm sure there's places where it makes sense, and my neighborhood's probably not one of them, but other neighborhoods might be. Maybe Saline isn't as likely as other places. I'm certainly a frequent customer and user of short-term rentals. So I just think we need to make sure that either through code review or through council, that we're taking this forward. And I think the more communities that actually have a stated position, the more leverage we have with the state when they try to go down the legislation route, and the less confusion our residents might have if they do in fact want to get into this business. So maybe, Ben, you could tell us if anything's happening, or?
Yeah, this was a
Councilmember.
point of conversation around the ADU ordinance. I have already reached out to our attorney to see if he had anything. He sent me a kind of a boilerplate draft that I was hoping to bring to code review in the not too distant future. It is another like kind of a heavier lift item, so it's been not on the top of my to-do list, but we have started turning the wheels on it, and we should be moving forward with something relatively soon. It will likely have to be regulated in some capacity, not likely to the same capacity as our regular commercial rental properties, because that would be a whole undertaking in and of itself. But definitely, at least getting a permit through the city, perhaps a special land use for them, just to make sure that we're cognizant of where they are, and that, we're separating them potentially from, smaller neighborhoods or out of condo associations that are pretty tight, and definitely out of other commercial rentals, so.
I would encourage prioritize. I know there's a lot to do, but I think this could become more problematic if we don't have something and folks start to use that lack of clarity. And then it creates problems not only for them, or maybe whoever bought their property with the expectation they could use it, or whoever committed to renting it. What's going on in Park Township over by Holland right now is just a real shame for those property owners and for the people who thought they'd have places to vacation. So it's just problematic the longer it goes on.
Did they cut them out there, or what happened?
Yeah, they said October 1st, nobody is allowed to use any short-term rentals in any residential district in the entire township. Now, they actually had some sort of archaic law long before Verbo and Airbnb, like from 1974, and they revived it and said this is now in place. I don't think it was written for that purpose, but nevertheless, it probably leaves a lot of property owners with some problems and a lot of vacationers with nowhere to go, would be my guess.
Yeah, I mean, the city of Ann Arbor has a short-term rental ordinance. It is somewhat an object lesson because it doesn't address certain things. There have been some developers who try to turn essentially apartment buildings into de facto hotels, but outside of lodging legislation or regulation. I don't know how much of a market we have here in Saline for short-term rentals, but it's also possible that a community that actually does regulate it would be exempted from whatever Lansing does. And that's another reason to at least think about it. And we want to be also, I think, deferential to private restrictions. That issue gets litigated a lot. And some people take the position that if it's permitted under local ordinance, that overrides a private restriction. That's legally incorrect in my opinion, but it's something to consider to make clear, because Ann Arbor doesn't actually state that clearly, and it does give room for that type of argument.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we always tend to hold firm on, is that the HOA is privately held between you and your condo board.
Absolutely correct, but people are making those arguments.
Right, so it's definitely language that we can insert there, that we could say if you're within an HOA, you need an approval letter, which is something sometimes we even see for like detached accessory structures or fences even, so.
Yeah, I think that's smart.
Council, when we were discussing the ADU issue, this came up, and it was like just another thing that kind of was almost sidetracking Mr. Harrington, unfortunately, from our council discussions, but it's one of the things that's being brought up, and I think another individual will probably bring it up again. Because we did do a thing for B&Bs, but we never really did anything outside of short-term rentals, and we do have, what, 2 or 3 in town?
4, actually.
4 now, okay.
Right, so one thing I've noticed when I was looking at Dexter's ADU ordinance, for example, is they prohibited the purpose of them for short-term rentals, so you can't use your accessory dwelling unit as a short-term rental, which I think, again, goes back to we're trying to allow for more housing and more symbiotic use, but if it's being a party house for some guy, now granted, people use their garage for that, but it's neither here nor there, but we could definitely make sure that we're protecting, the historic assets that we're trying to protect in the first place.
And that's what triggered the biggest discussions on the west side of the state, was that all the housing that was available for their employees and such got took up in terms of short-term, and so all of this was causing problems, besides all the partying and all the other stuff that was causing issues, but it was really, they had no housing that was available for use because people are willing to pay those exorbitant rates to be close to the lake, and was eliminating all that type of thing. So there is a issue to it, so.
I have a friend who is the GIS coordinator for Emmett County, which is home to Petoskey, and his rent is higher than mine, and I live in the city of Ann Arbor, and I find that kind of cynically sad and cynically funny in a way too, but it's definitely an issue when there's not enough housing for them. So.
Do we have a definition of short-term rentals? I mean, there are a number of people who may rent out their house 2 or 3 times a year for football weekends. Is that a short-term rental? I mean, even though they live there?
By
Is that
anybody's
5% of the
definition,
time?
that would be a short-term rental.
Yeah, so that would be considered a short-term rent. We have a very specific definition of like what a lease is for the rental inspection program. I would have to find it, but it was designed by an attorney and our consultant with Carla Wortman, Mike Radzik, different Mike. But again, trying to get away from the short-term rental regulation and really focus on commercial rentals. So there is a way to then add a different definition for short-term, which I believe our attorney's already sent me, what he's used in other communities as a kind of a boilerplate jumping off point for us to go from. So we can bring that to code review as soon as October, actually. So we can plan on doing that.
Every community could define it, whatever way they really wanted to.
Right.
No days, weeks, months, whatever.
And we may want to encourage it in certain areas, because I mean, like the one that's downtown, that's above the spa, that's like, what kind of disturbance would that be? It's kind of a thing downtown, like a hotel would have been downtown, so if you had second floors, but you don't necessarily want to allow it in a quiet neighborhood.
And that's why I brought it to this group, because it will ultimately probably end up being a zoning question once you get the definition figured out.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Beardsley. If there's no other discussion, is there a motion on the table to excuse?
Just actually one
Yep.
question. Ben, and maybe I missed it when you mentioned before, status at 207.
Yeah, so it'll likely be at the second meeting in October for a final PUD review. So there's just some minor items engineering-wise, and then some elevations we needed to see of the houses themselves, so what they're proposing to be consistent with the PUD, the preliminary version of it. So they had to send it, they submitted one, and then we had to resubmit essentially to complete the application. But it's now completed. We've sent it out for review today, so we should hopefully have it back in time for noticing and everything for the second meeting in October, at which point, if you approved it there, it would go to the next city council meeting in November, and then likely have final approval in November.
Right, so no hiccups or anything that.
Nothing was materially changed really on the site. There's some concern over the road width, but they've reemphasized there's only parking on one side of the street. So there was just some minor glitches between their preliminary and their final submittal that we just needed to smooth over to make sure that it was ready to go.
Great, thank you.
All good? If there is no other discussion, is there a motion on the table to excuse the absence of Mayor Morrow?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to adjourn at 7:58 PM?
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Thank you.
I'm printing off those 11 by 17 maps. I'm going to go run and grab them. They should pretty much be done, though. So I have one for each of you.